in a free society, everything is voluntary. But right now we're moving in the opposite direction because, you know, Fauci and Gates, they're determined that this is just the beginning and that we've just entered a decade of vaccines and that we're going to have vaccines for everything. And that to me is scary. And we need to get the government out of the business. They're not capable of providing protection. It's not the job of the government to make us economically secure or safe. That's the job of individuals, because governments tend to end up doing exactly the opposite.
This is Dan Dix here reporting for Press for Truth. We got a great show lined up for you today, guys, so let's just jump right into it. Joining me on the line today is the one and only Dr. Ron Paul of the Liberty Report. Ron Paul Liberty Report on YouTube is the channel. Sir, thank you so much for joining us here today. I wanted to get your views on the coronavirus, specifically the government's reaction to it, and also your views on how this may affect the economy should they prolong these lockdowns, and also your views on Dr. Anthony Fauci and how Trump now wants to have him fired. But before we get into any of that, I think it's important for people to be able to understand the past in order to understand the present and maybe even the future. And you, sir, are someone who has experience with this. In fact, your first year in Congress was 1976, and back then, the swine flu was the epidemic. That was the thing to deal with. So maybe you could start us off by telling us, how did the government deal with that at that time, and what sorts of lessons can we learn from that for how they're dealing with it today?
Well, even back then, I had my skepticism of government intervention and my opinion about medical care. But it was interesting. It was the very first week I won a special election. It was, I think, in the summer of '76 or spring of '76, and Ford was president, and we heard about the swine flu coming in, and the president was going to have a tough re-election, or not a re-election, it was an initial election. So they had to attack this. So they immediately made it a political event. And they said, well, we have to stop this epidemic from coming. This is preventative medicine. So they rushed through some legislation. I think it was $137 million. Sounds like not too much money, but back then it was a significant amount. And we had a vote. And I remember in the House vote, there were two of us that voted against it. And the other one, the other person that voted against it was also a doctor, you know, from Georgia, Larry McDonald. But the interesting thing is they rushed the vaccine through. The vaccine was not properly made. It did have nothing to do with the virus that was out there. So it saved nobody's life from it. It caused a lot of harm. More people ended up dying from the inoculation than they died from the flu that year. And that sort of was a lesson, like that's a little bit too extreme, but that's about what happens when governments get involved and do things for political reasons. But it was also because a lot of people ended up getting the vaccine. I think there were like 50 people or more had got Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is temporary total paralysis, and you can die from it, but most of them did get better. But it was a very, very serious complication of a virus, a viral injection, you know, a vaccine. So that made me skeptical more so than ever, but just the principle of who should be taking care of these problems, private markets and doctors and patients, or should it be some bureaucrat or some international bureaucrat or some drug company that's trying to manufacture vaccines? That's really the questions that we should ask.
Well, moving forward then, having said that, should people be a little leery of these potential COVID-19 vaccines potentially coming down the road? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, they should be leery about it. Right now, I wouldn't think there's any indication for anybody to take them because I think all the scare tactics are scare tactics. Some people have died. There's no doubt, but very, very few of the many thousands that have supposed to have died, they've all had 3 or 4, you know, a large majority had 3 or 4 other diseases, and they're elderly people in nursing homes. And they've been instructed by CDC and other politicians that when you the doctor sign a death certificate, if they have 4 different things, but they happen to have a positive test for the virus, that is to be put down as the major cause of death. So the numbers mean nothing. And then when it comes to how many people don't they measure, how many people got the virus, and it had no effect. My son had it, and he got better without any treatment. So there are probably millions of people. The number, percentage-wise, the number is probably very, very small. We know that influenza kills a lot more people than the coronavirus, because we don't even know how many people the coronavirus killed, but it's a lot less than what they claim. But it's just a justification to rush and politicize it, spend money and get it geared up to have vaccines. But just from what I know, if next week they came out and said, you know, we have a vaccine and it was 99% is going to protect you from coronavirus. Ron, don't you think you should take it? And I said, no, I don't want to. I wouldn't take it, but I think the one thing in a free market and free market medicine, the doctor and the patient and their attitudes make the decision, not a bureaucrat. When the bureaucrat makes the decision, it happens. What happens is what happened in 1976. People die from the treatment. And it shouldn't be that way. It should be individual. In a free society, everything is voluntary. But right now, we're moving in the opposite direction because, you know, Fauci and Gates, they're determined that this is just the beginning and that we've just entered a decade of vaccines and that we're going to have vaccines for everything. And that to me is scary. And we need to get the government out of the business. They're not capable of providing protection. It's not the job of the government to make us economically secure or safe. That's the job of individuals, because governments tend to end up doing exactly the opposite.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how the government is dealing with this in terms of the economy. It seems to me that they are across the globe shutting down small and medium-sized businesses, and this, of course, is going to have massive ramifications on people globally, may in fact even lead to more deaths than the disease ever could initially. So what do you think prolonged lockdowns could potentially do to the global economy, and could this be leading into the territory of being worse than the Great Depression?
It certainly could, because this is the biggest bubble ever in the history of mankind. And the bubble itself was a problem, but then they came along with this artificial problem of the coronavirus. I mean, it exists, but my point was that it's not nearly the crisis that it was made out to be. But they can use this as the real reason why we're having an economic crisis. But it's really the financial system that is collapsing, and the Federal Reserve's fault, and us spending too much money. But no, because of the close down, it's aggravating. It's making the crisis, the financial crisis and the depression, much, much worse. So the most important thing they could do right now is allow people to go to work and let the decision be made by the individuals, the individual business people and the individuals who want to go to work. The risk should be dependent on two individuals willing to decide how dangerous it is. So if somebody still wants to go to church in a large crowd in a free society, they could do that. But when the government regulates it, they ruin it for everybody. But I think what's happening here, the overreaction with the coronavirus, is going to make a very, very serious depression that much worse. And if they don't correct it, all it does is prolong it. Just spending trillions of dollars will not solve our problem. And they've already committed approximately $10 trillion since this crisis hit. Spending money like that just makes things worse. But when people aren't allowed to go to work and people are just, depending on printing money forever, all you're going to see is a price inflation. If you look at the gold price right now, you realize what the markets are anticipating. So the sooner our government lets us go back to normal activities and let us decide what is dangerous or what is not. We cannot depend on the government to dictate our every move to decide whether it's safe or not.
Well, how do you think people should be dealing with this moving forward? I mean, yesterday there was actually a protest in Vancouver that I went down to film and cover it. And it's now #1 trending on Twitter, "End the lockdown." Is this something you think people should do, is to push back against these incremental approaches on our freedoms?
Well, absolutely. If we don't, I've been doing this for 30 some years before, as it was starting. To me, the answers all come from a ideological struggle, and it's philosophic, and that has to change. But people have to stand up and they have to know what's behind their ideas. The people who are going to oppose you will say, well, you don't care about people, you want to kill people, and we're going to take care of people, and we're going to feed people. Well, it never works. So you have to have the answer, which is going to be sound money, limited government, free markets. This is what gave us the largest middle class ever. So this is something that has to be, and everybody has to make their own decision on how to do it. I try to do it by developing ideas and explaining to people why we shouldn't even have a Federal Reserve System, then we wouldn't have financial bubbles. And of course, I believe in free market medicine. If you had totally free market medicine, you wouldn't first have the recession, depression, then you wouldn't have, the government getting in and having these shutdowns. Because I was raised when there were a lot of contagious diseases, and you never had a total shutdown of a world. Now since our dollar system is worldwide, we closed down the economic system worldwide. So we need to return to the principles that emphasizes freedom of expression and freedom to trade, and we could get out of this. The longer we do what we're doing right now, if people stand up, if they can help get it reversed, my personal opinion is, anything you can do to get this stopped and reversed by peaceful means, we ought to do it.
I agree. By peaceful means is the key as well. Lastly, real quickly, because I mentioned it in the beginning, I wanted to get your views on Trump calling for Fauci to be fired, more specifically your views on how Fauci's doing and should he be out?
Well, he's been there way too long. He's the epitome of what our problem is. He's a government bureaucrat mixed in with corporatism, and we have a Bill Gates who finances him, and they have this strategy to take over the world, essentially, with CDC and also WHO. Gates finances all this, and they believe sincerely that the best thing for the world, more vaccines, and they want to make the next decade the decade of vaccinations and vaccines, and that to me is wicked. And there's no reason why they should be doing this. Government shouldn't be in that business. And this is why people are finally getting annoyed. I am very pleased when I see this. And once again, I believe in resistance. I believe in it intellectually. I'd like to see it all be peaceful. But the trouble is, if this continues and we don't offer up our solutions by a peaceful change, there's going to be a lot more violence. That's what's coming, because all we're seeing now is the destruction of wealth, and then telling people you can't even work to try to take care of yourself. I mean, it's the worst of all worlds when it comes to doing the best thing for people around the world. And certainly in the United States, this country is getting much poorer, much faster. But we had an economy that was very fragile anyway because of our previous policies. So I think people should speak out. They have a responsibility, but they have to know what they believe in. And that is, for me, free markets and personal liberty and a non-interventionist foreign policy, getting rid of the Federal Reserve, getting rid of the IRS. Let people go back to work. Let them keep what they earn and let them take care of their lives. Believe me, it'll be much better than a dependency on the government.
Very, very well said. I would add decentralization is key. Essentially decentralize from the government in every aspect of your life as possible, and you'll be better off moving forward. So once again, Dr. Ron Paul, thank you so much for joining us here today.
You're welcome. Nice to be with you.
We all want truth. The truth will set you free.